Welcome to our panel on data feminism. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining today to our panel, as I mentioned, on data feminism with Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein, the authors of the book Data Feminism. My name is Sara Rose Taylor. I am one of the network coordinators for FemQuant. I'm also the principal researcher at the Framework Convention Alliance for Tobacco Control as my day job. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Feel free to turn on video and unmute. We have Catherine D'Ignazio, who is an assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT. She is also the director of the Data plus Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. Catherine is a scholar, artist/designer, and a hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. Lauren Klein is an associate professor in the departments of English and quantitative theory and methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Before moving to Emory, she taught in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. Lauren works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and early American literature with a focus on issues of gender and race. So together, they are the authors of Data Feminism, which is a truly fantastic book that came out last year. Thank you both so much for joining us today, especially so early on a holiday in the US. We really appreciate it. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think actually when Lauren and I scheduled this, we were just chatting that I think we both forgot that it was a holiday today. So like, oh, okay. So, it's like, when you think about things months in advance, you're like, that sounds great.
Totally. And these days,
nevertheless, we're really happy to be here, and we're really excited about the whole theme of the conference.
We certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll just echo Catherine and saying thanks so much for having us. The tweets coming out of the conference, I just scanned the timeline this morning and they just look so amazing. So I'm looking forward to hearing from speakers and audience members later on.
Absolutely. So let's get started in our discussion, which I'm very excited to moderate. We'll start with something pretty foundational. What exactly is data feminism?
Well, I'll start and then probably pass the baton to Lauren. So we came together, well, gosh, now almost like 5 years ago or something, but we came together around this idea that, something that goes mostly unacknowledged in data science practices as they are, as currently the mainstream practices of data science go, that power is not distributed equally in the world. So those who wield it, and increasingly we talk about data as a form of power, it's certainly a form of capital, certainly a form of profit, right? And those who wield data are disproportionately elite, straight, white, able-bodied, cisgender, people from the global north, men, and so on. So the starting point of data feminism is to kind of look at these unequal power relations in data science, but then also to say, if we're coming from a grounding in intersectional feminism, what do we bring into that? Like, how do we bring intersectional feminist, both theory and activism, into data science? And what does the data science look like that truly embodies a kind of intersectional feminist principles? But then maybe I'll pass to Lauren to continue to build on that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great introduction. And maybe I'll just emphasize what Catherine pretty much has already said, which is this fundamental focus around power. So how we define data feminism is at root a form of data science that begins by taking power into account. So you cannot produce feminist data science. And in our view, you cannot produce good data science if you don't begin by looking around you and saying or asking, how has power already overdetermined this environment, whether it's the technical environment or the social environment that I am inserting my project into. And then once you are aware of how power has already influenced things, what can I do to either mitigate the power imbalances that I know to exist, to make my own data science project more equitable, and so on and so forth.
So I'm sure this kind of blends into exactly what you get into in the book. But for those who are unfamiliar with the book, would you mind outlining some of the key ideas and principles that you put forward in the book based on this idea?
Sure. So the book is actually structured around a set of principles. Oh, wait, I have it. Oh, backwards, forwards. So the book, it has seven chapters? Seven chapters. You can tell it's super early where we are right now on a holiday weekend. And each of the chapters is oriented around a single principle that we've developed by thinking through essentially all of the things that Catherine and I have brought together from our training and our schooling in feminist thinking, very broadly conceived, with a strong emphasis on intersectional feminism, but not limited to intersectional feminism. So the principles are examine power, that's the first one per our comments already. Challenge power, that's the second one. Rethink binaries and hierarchies. That's actually the fourth one, but when I narrate them, I like to put it third. Per the conference, elevate emotion and embodiment, consider context, embrace pluralism, and make labor visible. And then we have a conclusion that's a little bit about, where do we go from here? Maybe, so those are the principles. And maybe I'll just pass to Catherine to see if there's anything you want to fill in on this note.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I'll add is, I think, again, just to reiterate the point we've already said, but, that's what Lauren was saying, each of those principles that she mentioned is one of the chapters in the book. One of the things we really tried to do in the book was to write, because we're bringing together two worlds that are not often talking to each other, sort of feminist theory, gender studies, and data science, technology, design, and so on. We tried to not try to assume prior knowledge. And so what we do in each of those chapters is we try to introduce the feminist theorists, thinkers, activists who have led us to formulate that principle. So we don't assume people already know of people like Patricia Hill Collins or Donna Haraway. And then we also try in each of those chapters about, per each principle to show in action people who are doing that principle already in their data science or data visualization or other kinds of data practices. So to say these are not sort of impossible things, there's already people who are using data to challenge power. There's already people who are elevating emotion and embodiment and so on. And then I think maybe the only last thing to say is that you will see that those first two principles and the first two chapters in the book are about power. So examine power and challenge power. And I think, again, it just comes back to the centrality of an analysis of power. That's really what's at the heart of the intersectional feminist project. It's a desire to use data science, analytical methods to really analyze inequality in many forms. That might be sexism, but it also might include racism, colonialism, and many other forms of inequality, and then to think about how we use it to change that. So that's why there's really, a lot of the book is sort of that's the through line. It's around power.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the many things I really enjoyed about the book is it doesn't matter where your starting point is in the conversation, the way that you're talking about things, the examples you bring in, the kind of through lines. And, certainly we in the FemQuant network, it's a pretty multidisciplinary bunch. And a lot of us are doing interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work. So it's great that it doesn't matter what your starting point is. It's the way the book is presented, you can kind of come from anywhere and join the discussion, which is fabulous. So in terms of, I guess, chapter 4 in the book, as Lauren mentioned, certainly relevant to today's discussion, wondering in terms of, working beyond the gender binary variable and problematizing the use of gender as a binary variable in quantitative research, what do you think folks at the conference today can learn from your work, and what can we take away from your approach to this?
Sure. Yeah, again, I'll start and then pass. But so we have this whole, whatsoever the chapter, Rethink, Binaries and Hierarchies, and the sort of title of that chapter is What Gets Counted Counts. And that chapter is all about categorization, classification, and yeah, we do spend a good amount of that chapter talking about the gender binary. And if we take seriously what we know from feminist theory, from lots of feminist theory and also queer theory, is a kind of problematization of the gender binary, that we kind of inherit this received idea of the gender binary, particularly those of us in the kind of Anglo-Western context. That's the sort of received wisdom, the common sense wisdom. It's what's getting by default built into a lot of apps, data-driven systems, automated decision-making systems, algorithms, and so on. But if we take seriously what feminist theorists tell us, the gender binary is just wrong. Is literally empirically wrong to code gender as a binary, to classify gender as a binary, to think about gender as a binary, because there are, and there always have been, more than two genders. And so that's like a kind of baseline starting point. So that it's sort of empirically wrong. And then the other point that feminist theorists would make is that it's hiding a hierarchy. The gender binary is actually not kind of two categories on equal footing. It's actually like men are here and women are here. So that's another reason why we should be deeply suspicious of it. But then, thinking about so then how do we translate that into data science practices, data visualization practices? That's where it gets a little bit more tricky. And we run into the issue of what we talk about actually a lot in the book, this idea that data are a double-edged sword, meaning, just because we know that gender is not a binary, it doesn't necessarily follow from that then we should always be asking people like, are you transgender? Or, what's your sexuality? Or, what gender do you identify as even, or even asking them about gender, in the first place. So those, it doesn't necessarily follow from that, because we have to be thinking about, and this kind of leads to another principle, which is around context. We have to be thinking about who is collecting data about whom. And in particular, if we're talking about folks who live their gender outside of the binary, then them being made visible in data sets because of existing oppressions and stigmatization may make them more vulnerable to various authorities, institutions. They may actually want to harm them. So that's why it's not an easy linear thing to just say step 1, step 2, step 3 is actually kind of a deeper contextual problem. But maybe I'll pass to Lauren to build.
Sure. No, yeah, maybe I'll just continue along that line of thinking and put a name to what Catherine has been describing, which is something that we talk about in the book. We talk about something called the paradox of exposure, which is precisely this. There is a desire to undertake data science projects, all projects, in the interests of those who could be helped by social services, by financial support, counseling, what have you, right? But when dealing with minoritized groups, and gender minorities are one of these, the very act of pulling these people out of a data set may be in order to help them, may be the exact same act that invites harm, right? And those two, that is the exact same act of counting or classifying. They're not two separate things. they're exactly the same thing. And we see this not just in terms of gender minorities, but an example that we see a lot in the US has to do with immigration status, right? Same type of situation. Can you identify undocumented immigrants so as to provide legal assistance, a welcome basket, what have you? The exact same thing, identifying the addresses of people who are undocumented may bring, ICE to their door, immigrations and customs enforcement, right? And so this is why, again, it really comes back to these questions of power and thinking through, again, sort of how power is distributed right now. And I think also connected to that, the potential for harm that derives from these pervasive unequal power systems, right? And then also thinking about context, right? So what is the context in which this particular information will be used? Do I, as the researcher, have the capacity to protect this information, not just now, but into the future? All of these are considerations that we need to, who is going to view the output of this report or whatever it is that you may be producing. All of these questions are things that you need to think through before and not after. And sometimes, even if you've collected the data, even if you have interesting things or potentially beneficial things to say or beneficial findings, you may end up not wanting to make those public, or you may end up wanting to publish not publish disaggregated gender data or something like that in order to protect essentially the small, either the outliers in your data set, the small category in your data set, the people who, because their group is so small in relationship to the other larger categories, may just expose them more than members of those other groups who are protected by numbers. And actually, Catherine has a really good paper about this particular thing. I don't know if you want to put in a plug for it.
Thanks, Lauren. I just wrote, so I have a contribution in a volume that I edited too. So there's a little nepotism of myself. But the book is called Uncertain Archives. And it's a dictionary of terms around big data, sort of redefining key terms of big data. And I have an essay contribution there that looks at the term outlier. And thinks about that in relation to gender and in relation to non-binary genders in particular in large data sets. And that point that Lauren was just making, this is a really important point, which also the research of Oliver Hameson, I think who's at University of Michigan, has also made, which is this idea where people who are small in numbers, groups that are small in numbers, even in a potentially extremely large data set, can be much more vulnerable by the fact of belonging to this group in small numbers. You can imagine if you say we're collecting whether somebody was non-binary or whether somebody was transgender, even in a very large, millions of rows data set, those folks are going to be made visible, and particularly if there's further, personally identifying information, they could become targets through that. But maybe one last thing to say about this, because we're really emphasizing the complexity side of it here, but I think there are some really simple things that folks can do as well. And again, starting from that baseline that gender is not a binary, that is wrong. It's just empirically not. So one of the things we started doing in the book, we, like others, were talking about work that had been done by other people. We often in our own work have to work with data that was collected by other people, which may have been collected in a binary way. And so I think one of the things that all of us can start doing here and now immediately is whenever we work with these data sets or whenever we use a data visualization that is depicting gender as a binary, because that's whatever, it's necessary to the argument or something, that it's really important to then put this data was collected as a binary, gender is not a binary. There's a lot that you can do with the framing devices, either in the narrative, the argument of the paper, in the title or the caption of the data visualization that you're presenting. There's a lot you can do, even when you have non-ideal data, to push back against the notion that gender is a binary. Because we have to think about every time when we use those data that are binary data, if we use them at face value and don't sort of call out that oversight, we ourselves are then also reinforcing the idea that gender is a binary by just having a bar chart that shows men and women or something like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's such an important overall point that you were making about, the way data and data collection can render certain things visible very much connects with some of our discussions about, census data and the tensions there between, the value of being counted, but also the potential risks. And that's certainly something in my work in health, where, health status, especially in a lot of low and middle income countries talking about HIV/AIDS, there's the access to service component, but there's also the very high risk of violence component. So you see it in so many issues, and certainly something that we as researchers need to think about our role in that and our, I guess, position of power in a sense, in terms of what is our duty to protect those that we're gathering data on, and how we influence the outcomes that impact them directly or indirectly. So I'm really glad that you brought up that point. Now, in terms of, though, gathering data and its other impacts, in the book, you state that the process of converting qualitative experience into data can be empowering and even has the potential to be healing. And I found that really kind of struck me, just again, one of the impacts of the work that we do. It's not necessarily an impact that we think of. Often we'll think maybe of, the impact of our research on policy or on our career. But having this, empowering, potentially healing component to it is really fascinating to me. So I was wondering if you could dive into a bit more what you mean by that statement and how you've seen that reflected in your own work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that line comes from a discussion actually of another of Catherine's projects. So maybe I'll let her talk about that part. But what we were talking about more generally has to do with how individual experience, especially individual experiences of oppression or marginalization, can often be affirmed by recognizing that me, we're not alone, right? Very often, and we talk about a couple of instances of this in the book, starting from the introduction. For example, the differential maternal mortality rates among Black women and white women in the United States, where we talk about a series of personal experiences and newspaper reportage and ultimately data collection efforts that went from individuals thinking, this terrible accident happened to my sister or my friend, but it must have just been an accident, or there was no right, it just happened, to the realization that this awful thing that had happened in one family actually was part of a systemic problem. And there was a cause. And that realization that this was part of a systemic pattern had only come about in this particular case through an act of data collection. And it was actually an interesting act of data collection because it wasn't just saying, +1, did this happen? So you check the box, but it was asking people to share their stories. It was the act of aggregating stories that all affirmed the same fact that more Black women than white women had died during childbirth in the United States, but also affirmed sort of certain key details that led to, I wouldn't say, I think in that particular context, the harm is death, and that is, something that can take a really long time to heal from on the part of the family. But I think it did lead to some sense of sort of shared experience, and in that way, was offered some comfort and solace in that particular situation. There's other situations, I think, less severe that we also talk about in the book. There was, for example, an audit done of, it was gender in behind the screen filmmaking roles. So essentially anyone who wasn't an actor. So, producers, PAs, technicians, things like this. I think it's a project called, what's it called? Calling the Shots, I believe. And so they essentially had to create a data set of all the people involved in the UK film industry. They had a very involved methodology for identifying the gender of each person whose name they collected. And they have a really thoughtful methodology statement. I'll post it in the chat a little bit later. But then they ended up speaking to some women and non-binary folks and saying, did you know that you are one of two, sound editors working on films in the UK, and have these quotes from interview participants saying like, I always knew, who knew? I guess I just never really knew that there were other people like me out there. I just sort of assumed I was the only one. And so sort of this building of awareness, again, that underrepresentation in this particular case is part of a systemic problem. But the healing aspect of it, I think, is connected to some earlier modes of, what non-quantitative modes of sharing collective experience in the interest of solidarity and healing. And one of the things that we try to do, not just in this case in the book, but throughout, is to say, look, the things that we can do with data now are interesting and exciting and powerful, and yet they are connected to all sorts of modes of documenting and encountering sort of the richness of human experience that precede data. And we can learn and draw parallels to those earlier experiences. So maybe at this point, Catherine, I tried to give you an on-ramp. I don't know if you know where I'm going here, but do you want to talk about the breast pump hackathon?
Totally. Yeah. So I think for me, that line, it's somewhat speculative, but also I think in a way somewhat documented by, it came out of some of my own work on running hackathons called Make the Breast Pump Not Suck. So I collaboratively ran two such hackathons. One was in 2014 and one was in 2018. The one in 2018 focused specifically on racial and economic equity in breastfeeding in the United States context, where we have, I should mention, because it's important, we have no paid leave policy in the United States. So we're one of two countries in the world that doesn't have paid family leave on the birth of a child. Hence the reliance on breast pumps. But where that comes from is in both of those projects. So these were hackathons where we were both thinking about the breast pump as a technology, but in both cases it was broader than that. The question that we were kind of designing around, hacking around, building things around was really how do we make the postpartum experience and the breastfeeding experience better for women and breastfeeding people and chest feeding people in the context of the United States, which is a really just basically terrible country to have a baby in. And so we had these kind of broad-based questions, and a lot of what we did in the lead up to both events was this sort of story collection. And in the first one, it happened very accidentally. In fact, the first hackathon came together really quickly. And as we were pulling it together, we put out a call on the internet and said, we're having this hackathon. It's called Make the Breast Pump Not Suck. Send us your ideas for improving this technology. It's kind of very narrowly focused on the technology at that point. And the interesting thing was that we got back, we thought maybe we'd collect 20 to 30 stories that we could use at the hackathon to kind of seed people's events and ideas or designs and ideas. We got 1,000 stories sent to us. They were long, they were detailed, they were stories of trauma and pain. They were stories of parents' sort of whole trajectory through the prenatal and postpartum sort of ecosystem and the points of failure along the way. We got 10-page Google document, 10-point plans for fixing everything. It was incredible. And so one of the ways that we ended up sort of using the events was to pool these stories. So in both cases, we did like a story collection process and then like also a story presentation process. Because, you know, what happens, like Lauren was saying, in the context, especially of issues related to sort of women's, pregnant people's, breastfeeding people's bodies, these are issues that have been typically relegated to the private sphere. So these are things that if we experience pain and trauma, if we are mistreated by our health systems, we often blame ourselves, right? Like we often think like, oh, that's my problem. I failed. I failed to do X. I failed to do Y. I have this birth trauma. It's my fault, you know? And the point of sharing those stories and sort of presenting them in these sort of creative ways in both cases at both events was, I would say, very aligned with what feminist consciousness raising groups in the kind of second wave feminism were doing, which is how do we pool our lived experiences, including and especially our experiences of pain and stigmatization. How do we pool those and ultimately build our own consciousness towards this idea that it's structural, like and that's the whole thing behind the second wave feminists, like the personal is political, something that's reiterated in the Combahee River collective statement. It's through this building of personal experience, it's the aggregation of that helps to build our solidarity and sort of consciousness raising so that we can start to seek political solutions and structural solutions and sort of stop blaming ourselves, basically. And so actually, I'll put a link to a paper. We wrote about the hackathons as feminist consciousness raising. So I'll put a link to that paper. But for me, that's the way in which data science can potentially be healing for a community that has experienced trauma in some way. But I think in these cases, it really matters who's doing the work really matters. You know, this is a case where some like parachuting researcher from outside of a community can't do that work. Like it's work that has to be done by pooling shared experiences. Like it can't be done with these large power differentials. That's, I think, why we say like it's community that's counting for itself, with itself, sort of that positionality, I think, really matters on these issues.
Absolutely. I think it gets back to, you know, the responsibility as researchers in these spaces to basically take care of the participants and how they're, you know, represented and how they're worked with. And so there's a lot to think about. And I think it also, the point gets back to what you're saying about the double-edged sword of data collection in terms of, you know, rendering things visible. On the one hand, we have discussed, you know, potential harms and risks, but then the other hand, rendering visible can be such a powerful experience and perhaps like a way to gather power and come together collectively. So there's so much to dive into and so many different aspects there. And I think this kind of ties into as well ideas of activism. And activism is something you bring up in the book, you know, as part of feminism, as well as part of, you know, data feminism specifically. But many of us, I find, as researchers, don't necessarily see ourselves as activists or as doing advocacy work, depending on your position and situation. Certainly, that's something I've grappled with as a researcher, and I now work in civil society doing a lot of advocacy work, and it's been a very different role for me. So I'm wondering from your work and your points of view, what can we as feminist quantitative researchers, either working in academia or outside of it, what can we do to bring more activism into our work? And what are some other examples of that?
Are we good there first, Lauren?
Oh, sure.
I'll start and then pass. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because you know, it's thinking about like what is the relationship to activism and advocacy, particularly when legitimate knowledge production, like knowledge production that's like sort of classified as legitimate by the academy, has been construed as being non-advocacy oriented or not activist in some way. And so it's a bit of a hard position to be in, I would say, actually, because in many cases, the whole project, I mean, like we said, the whole project of feminism is about interrogating power structures. And that really, really includes sort of whose ways of knowing, whose methods, whose knowledge has been legitimated by our institutions, and whose has been excluded, whose ways of knowing are excluded. And that's a big, Patricia Hill Collins in her book, Black Feminist Thought, spends a long time sort of talking about this idea of subjugated knowledge. So this idea that there are ways of knowing that are sort of systematically pushed out of institutions. And so, so I think depending on your field, you have more and fewer of those kinds of norms to be challenging. One of the ways that I'll just speak for myself, one of the ways that I navigate that is by working in more sort of design-based disciplines. So I publish in places like human-computer interaction journals where we can, right now we're studying activist practices with grassroots data, for example. And so it's an object of study, but we're also very much, I would say, working in solidarity with the activist groups that we are working with, and we're using participatory action research methods in that process. And so I think there are ways that I'm more upfront about that and lead with that. And then sometimes when I'm writing grants, let's say, there are other ways that I frame that work, which are still very true. And so it's not departing from truth, but there is a different sort of framing around what the work is and what its sort of contribution is and to whom. And so I think these are real tensions. I just want to sort of recognize that. But I think for myself, I have no tension around the idea of working in solidarity with activist groups who are working towards gender and racial liberation. And I actually see, for me, my role as being a really important one of trying to explore how can academia, again, be in solidarity, not take over, not lead even, but literally work to support, validate and legitimate in some cases, work to sustain some of the labor of activist groups. So that's sort of where my own thinking is at on that. But I do think it's very field specific, the ways that you have to navigate these questions.
I love that. I think the importance of not letting the authority that you sort of acquire and inhabit over time as an academic get in the way of allowing activist groups to lead is so important. I'll just say from my own perspective, I'll say something general, then I'll say something specific. There are a lot of different ways to contribute to a larger collective effort to make change, right? And, we think of activist groups being that's probably the most visible and legible way of making change, but change never happens only from the margins, right? It always involves a process of ideas coming from the activist groups pushing for change, becoming adopted by, a center-left coalition, and using that to create sort of, broad, lasting social impact, at least on the, the legislative, governmental, economic agenda. I'm grossly generalizing, but the point here is that, social change involves coalitions of groups of people who are each contributing what they can from the perspectives that they come from, right? And because you are, at a think tank or in academia or whatever, and are not necessarily yourselves leading an activist group, doesn't mean that you can't lend support to those efforts, or even try to learn from those efforts independently and apply those to your research. And so, I'll say that now I'll sort of shift to the personal. So I do a lot of historical work. So, I take in my work, I do a couple of things, but one of the major things that I do is apply quantitative text analysis to historical data sets. And I'm interested in historical social movements and, in general, but like these don't like, I'm talking like 18th, 19th century, like these groups are not around anymore to go, help, right? We just sort of need to analyze their record. But one of the things that I've tried to do in my own research practices is think about how I can center these ways of thinking and these approaches to, I would say research, but I almost want to say sort of like knowledge production and sharing to make it seem more general. So, things that you can do if you are part of a research team, leading a research team, about to start a lab or whatever, thinking about just building up a more inclusive team, in your own group, who am I inviting in? Who am I giving opportunities to? I think a lot about, because I deal with a lot of students, sort of who writes to me to ask to be included versus who might I seek out and who might not see themselves as called by this work or think that they can do it. Actually, if I identify someone who I think would make a good fit for this work, I write to them. For a long time, I was just sort of, when someone wrote to me and said, could I be involved? I would say, sure, but that really skews towards people who view themselves as authorized to do the work beforehand, which tends to be people coming from general sort of more, generally male, generally white, like sort of from these dominant social groups that have always viewed themselves as authorized to do more technical work, to write to professors and ask. The other thing that I think about a lot is both co-authorship, like whose work should be guiding this project, what kind of expertise am I missing from my own area of research? And if I'm entering a domain that I don't myself know a ton about, I feel like the academic tendency is to read a lot and think that you can learn it. But an alternative is just to invite in as a co-author someone who's already been doing this work for a long time. For instance, like on my work on social movements, I developed this language model that was identifying instances of language change and associating them with particular groups. And we were looking at this historically, and then we were like, hey, we could actually apply this to a contemporary data set, like the work of Black Lives Matter, for instance. And initially I was like, oh, I can learn about Black Lives Matter. Like who's written on, Black Lives Matter on Twitter? I'll go read that stuff. But then I thought to myself, no, these are the people who actually should be involved as contributors and originators of this project. Another thing you can do, and I'll try to just sort of wrap up here, but like think about the politics of your citations. Don't just cite people because they're the canonical source, but cite intentionally. Try to give place to scholars, underrepresented scholars producing the work that has really they've had to fight to get it accepted as legitimate scholarship. And even, in peer reviews, when people say, how come you didn't cite X or Y and Z? You can respond out, like in the response to the peer review and say, I know that, but I'm choosing this other lineage of citation as opposed to just like slotting in the dudes, because they're mostly dudes who you get called out for not citing, back into the paper. Things like, and these are all kind of small things, and yet they all add up to work that, again, sort of helps to sort of like bend the arc of the narrative that these activist groups outside of academia, I think, have really led the charge of. And then one final thing I'll say, sorry about this. One final thing I'll say has to do with values. And this is something that Catherine and I did in writing Data Feminism, because it can feel, we're all sort of pressed for time and we often are making decisions on the fly, or now like in a 1-hour Zoom meeting that we have with their teams, every 2 weeks or whatever. You can come up with a set of values that guide your research that can be sort of a lodestone that you refer to or that you remind yourself of when you are making decisions. And these can be, and for instance, Catherine and I did have some sort of values, which were also principles that were guiding the work of the book that have to do with prioritizing, for example, people with direct experience of a particular issue, as opposed to studying that issue from a distance, intentionally prioritizing the work of women scholars, of scholars from underrepresented groups when given a choice between citing underrepresented groups versus those from dominant groups, like all sorts of things like this. And I admittedly was not sure that this would be a helpful thing when writing a somewhat scholarly book. I was aware of value statements from organizing, but I was like, I'm not sure if this will be helpful to us. And it turned out to actually be really helpful to us. And again, and I think, as academics in particular, we don't often have these documents or these statements to refer to, but they can really be helpful as a guide.
Yeah, that's a lot of really great points. And I think it's important to think of our work in terms of, the impact it has and that it can play an activist role, whether or not we see ourselves in that role. There is that element. And I think if I could briefly summarize the kind of some of the key messages here, having intention in our work, a values-based intention, and being collaborative, and in particular, having that support role, recognizing, yes, we have expertise in our certain area, but it doesn't mean we need to lead the charge. And maybe there are others better positioned to do that, but we can play a significant role with our work if done with intention. So I think that's really great, and hopefully something we can all kind of take forward, since we do all in our own way, and all our presenters here are doing really valuable work that can move things forward for us. So we've touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to dive in a bit deeper. In terms of knowledge production, how can we bring a data feminist stance into our research process? This is really like a process-based thing. We're all working on a research. How can we bring that in? And how do you think this would vary across disciplines, if at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think we've said a lot of the things that apply to this question. Thinking fundamentally about power. I think about how power, and I like the word overdetermined, like how power has sort of brought us to or already shaped the point at which we are beginning our research process, and being aware of that so that you can either respond, redirect course, rebalance, things like that. It's just so important, especially, because most of us who do the analysis of data are not the same ones collecting the data. And so we almost always are entering into a process that has already been overdetermined by power. And so not taking a minute or a month to pause and say, what am I looking at here? These questions, when I'm thinking about what questions that I can ask, what questions might I be able to ask, or what questions am I able to ask because I have the data, and what questions can I not ask because I don't have the data to answer them? And beginning from that point is so important. I actually think that's kind of a universal. I would say that holds across, any field. And I speak as someone I have an appointment that's split between the humanities and the social sciences. I deal with qualitative and quantitative. That's always, there's different ways of saying it, but that pretty much applies almost universally. Again, to underscore Catherine's point, which I've already underscored, who's at the table? How is the research being shaped? Whose knowledge are you drawing from? And if you're drawing from that knowledge, are those people or representatives of that group present with you? How are you using that knowledge in a way that is true to the intention of it? And again, I think, this also holds true. I think it plays out differently in different fields, whether it's if you're doing community-facing work, can you incorporate the community members into the project at the beginning rather than at the end? If you're doing user testing, can you invite people in at the beginning rather than the end? If you're drawing from a body of work or applying a method to some new domain, can you bring those domain experts in at the beginning, not the end? And I think this holds true across, humanities, social sciences, health, public policy. It seems it's an extra step to take because it's not naturalized in academic research, but it's actually not that hard when you set yourself up with an intention of doing it. I don't know, Catherine, do you have other thoughts about this?
I think the only additional one was kind of a point that related to the last question too. where Lauren was talking about our value statement. And we also had this system of sort of this way of auditing our citations, like thinking about our own citations in the book as a kind of a database and looking at like who was represented, whose thoughts, scholarship projects were represented by that database. And so for us, those were structures of accountability. So I think it's like what you said, Sarah, about intentions is super important. So it's obviously very important that we enter in with these, values and intentions and sort of in alignment. And then I think it's also important to keep in mind, like what in any given research project, how do we hold ourselves accountable? And so I think that's maybe a really important question because, and again, sort of like remembering to decenter our own expertise to a certain extent, like remembering that we are fallible human beings coming with our own different sort of formations, backgrounds, positionalities, et cetera. And that we don't necessarily always do things right. We have to assume that we don't, particularly when we are working across sort of divergence, like working with communities potentially where there are power differentials. And so too often research like on underserved communities or marginalized communities can be very extractive. So it can be like a way to like extract knowledge from people who are less served by our various institutions and then kind of like use it to further one's career and get tenure and whatever, and not necessarily sort of share back. So I mean, I think the question is like, how do you, within a research project, how do you build in those structures of accountability, shared governance, shared ownership? There's that great disability justice slogan, like nothing about us without us. So I kind of love that as a general sort of justice-oriented idea of like kind of how we should be working with various populations and groups. So I think that for me is like, I think there's work to be done across all fields in thinking about like, what are the structures where we hold ourselves and our institutions to account as we collaborate with groups outside of the academy.
Yeah, I think that's so important and certainly something that strikes me as an economist, which is my background. We are not great at doing that. And I think there's such an important role of kind of checking your ego at the door in some of this work. And as you say, like decentering a little bit our expertise and recognizing just the value of lived experience, not just for when we're trying to collect this data, but trying to actually understand it and move it forward. So every step of the research project at the beginning, learn, as you mentioned, bringing people in and how it impacts it throughout each stage, and then what happens next, and we have a role to play, and it's not always the star role to play in the different phases. That's really good points. So one last question before we go to audience Q&A. I'm curious to know how your book has been received and if you've had to deal with negative reactions to it. I'm sure most of us today, if not all of us at today's conference, have received pushback from bringing together feminist work and quantitative work. I know I have very, very much so. So how has your book been received by a wider audience? And in general, how have you navigated pushback and negative reactions to your work and the way you approach things?
Well, I'll tell two from, Lauren's very familiar with these, but two things that happened to me in the process of writing. Actually, before we even started writing, I think at one point. So like in the first case, a senior person in my department, which is not my current department actually, when I was starting this project, told me not to do it, the Data Feminism book, because it was a co-author book. And luckily, I ignored that advice. But I needed to, I talked to Lauren about it because Lauren, I forget, Lauren, if you already had tenure, but she was further along than I was in the process at that point. So that was one thing. Another mentor of mine, I'm sad to say, also when I told him the subject of the book proposal that we were writing, then gave me a very long mansplaining lecture on what feminism is and why I shouldn't do that and why I should focus on doing data literacy work to bring into corporations. And that was super disappointing. It was so disappointing. I think I had an anecdote about it in the book, but then I was like, oh, this makes me sound very angry, so I'm not going to do that. And then, I think in terms of the reception post-book, but I think I would say just in that process, like these are these points where what was really important for me was to talk to Lauren and to talk to sort of other people in my life who are part of my network and sort of support system, and people that can validate that this is a good path, you're on a good path, kind of follow that intuition that is the right thing to do. Because when you have senior people either in your field or your department or mentors who are telling you things like this, typically you try to listen to them. So like it was very important for me to seek out like sort of alternate perspectives in those cases. Following the publication, I think one of the more irritating reactions has been, a couple of times where we've given talks about the book where folks have said they want to kind of take out the feminist part. So they say, oh, this is good. This is just good data science. What you all are outlining is just good data science. Like everyone should do this. And I think I don't disagree. And I don't think we disagree that everybody should do this. But I think where we disagree is that this is not just good data science, because at least right now, and what we're talking about as data science, sort of mainstream data science, in no way centers relationships of power and inequality. Like that is not the focus of mainstream data science. And in general, those are pushed out and sort of kind of meant to be studied maybe as like variables in some kind of like causal inference framework, but like not actually looked at as kind of like the root of various kinds of discrimination and bias and so on. And so, I think that's where that for me is, I've had to like think about that the first time that I encountered that reaction, but then also sort of push back on that and say, no, you can't just like excise the feminism part and just call it good data science. Like that doesn't work. That's not what it is. And, hopefully one day it will just be like so mainstream, like we don't even have to call it feminist, but like that is not where we are in this day and age. So I don't know, Lauren, do you have any other ones that?
Yeah, I'll just continue on that point, which is, we do get that question a lot, like why, or people say like, weren't you scared to call it data feminism? Or, did it ever, like, why did you pick that title? And it is so funny because Catherine and I never thought of an alternative in which feminism was not in the title, centered in the project, any of these things. Like it just wasn't an option because feminist thinking writ large has been so influential in shaping how the two of us think. There wouldn't be a proper way to do this work, as Catherine said, without feminism, because, and Catherine and I, we haven't really talked about our own personal trajectories, but for me personally, sort of my path to academia and how I learned to think the way I think and my approaches to pretty much all of the work that I do is so informed by feminist ways of thinking and knowing that it's inseparable from those things. And I actually think it is true that more people have been impacted by some early feminist ways of thinking more than they know. And I think in many ways it has become, due to the really hard and thankless work of early feminist activists and scholars of sort of reorienting how people think, like a lot of this thinking has become more mainstream, but to disconnect it from those feminist roots, I think is to efface that early work that was harder, that did involve a lot more pushback, that, involved, that is a lot less thankless than a lot more thankless than the work that we are doing now. And I will say, to the flip side of that is like our book, in spite of, shock, surprise, like it has the word feminism in the title, like people are reading our book, like it's sold over 10,000 copies, like it's online, people are citing it a lot, so for those of you who are like, I don't know if this is a good career path for me, or maybe I should remove feminism from the work that I do per the advice of my senior faculty mentor, like you don't have to, right? Like people are ready for this. And there's been a very, very wide and supportive reception for this type of work. And so ultimately, I think it was a super affirming process that I think played out in better ways than Catherine and I even expected.
Great. I'm so glad to hear that. And I really appreciate you sharing your experiences with it, especially, earlier in the process and facing those critiques, as I think a lot of us kind of feel like in our departments or in our disciplines a bit of an island and don't necessarily have folks to share those experiences with. So I do appreciate you being open about some of the criticisms you faced. And I'm sure some people are nodding along at home and go, yeah, I've heard similar stuff. So we're certainly all in the same boat here. So unfortunately, we have come over time now. I could talk about this all day, but I will let you go. I really appreciate and thank you on behalf of everyone here, Catherine and Lauren, for joining us today and sharing your work and enduring all of our questions on a holiday. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, super
Thanks
exciting.
so much, Sarah.
So glad y'all are talking about all of these things. It's very exciting. We'll be following along on Twitter. So thanks.
Excellent.